Today's scripture reading is Daniel 3, verses 16 to 25. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent, and the furnace so hot, that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, Certainly, your majesty. He said, Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. This is the word of the Lord.
It is my pleasure and privilege to join with you as you come together for worship and reflection at our church's Ash Wednesday prayer meeting. We wish to collectively reflect around the synodical theme, Rooted and Resilient, Responding in Hope, using the text from Daniel chapter 3. The story of the 3 Hebrew men who challenge the king's edict and get thrown into the heated furnace to be released or to get out unscathed is oftentimes used by people of faith as some kind of a guarantee that God will protect or rescue us from any and every personal dilemma. That provides some people with the kind of protection, the kind of safety that they need, making them exempt from the vicissitudes of life. Oftentimes, readers of the text are looking for something that will tell them how to avoid hurt or pain and distress, how to secure God's favor, or how to get good results. This fits very well within our modern self-interested world that is obsessed with self-improvement, looking for the next and latest book on how to avoid discomfort, or the newest blog on the 10 steps to a pain-free life. Of course, this reading of the text assumes that if you are faithful, that you will be blessed. And conversely, if you are not faithful, then you won't enjoy the blessings of God. Again, it fits within the nature of our modern self-interested view about relationships, a view that is hugely transactional. And the first question is asked, what do I get out of this? Or what's in it for me? And so what it does is to reduce God to some kind of a sugar daddy, or God is only there or primarily there to ensure the best outcome for me. When we read the immediate context of this passage, which is the whole book of Daniel, we soon realize that not all faithful people are spared of rough outcomes. So by the end of the book, it's clear that not all the faithful cheat death. Even good, faithful God followers have to deal with truly horrendous and debilitating personal situations. So I submit to you, sisters and brothers, today that this passage is not a guide on how to avoid tough times. How then should we read this story? I believe that we should read this story not primarily as a story about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but ultimately as a story about God. Of course, it is their story too. The 3 young men's personal encounter, their personal faith, and their personal triumph. But the outcomes, the happenings of this story are impacted significantly and ultimately by the actions of God. God sets up God's self as a protagonist against whom Nebuchadnezzar attempts to engage in a contest to determine and establish superiority and dominance. And what happens at the end of the story? God shows who is boss. And he makes it obvious that the king is misguided and has an overinflated ego. Therefore, we should see the story as a direct attack on the presumptions of anything or anyone who challenges or seeks to displace the rule of God. You see, the three men in the story then show their hand as to where they hedge their bet. They use bold language in the defiance of the king's order, and they assert to his very face in verse 17, if we are thrown to the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But then they go on in verse 18 and say, but even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of the gold that you have set up. This confident hope that they express is not something that was contingent on their action. Hope is not something we do. Instead, it appears that hope is something that we buy into, that perhaps we live into or rest into. So their story is not just merely a heroic example of faith that you and I are called on to emulate. Instead, if we were to make the story about that, we would have to shift the focus from God to the pivotal action or actions that we must or should do. It would become something about us instead of something about God. Of course, their faithfulness to God is exemplary, but that is not the final point of the chapter. For the deepest source of amazement in the text is God's faithfulness to them. Even Nebuchadnezzar gets it and finally confesses, no other God is able to deliver in this way. He's amazed by God, not merely by the faith of the three Hebrew men. To appreciate the depth of the hope that is expressed and demonstrated by these three young men, we must read the story against the backdrop of their lived and shared experience. They were part of a group of refugees whose existence was constantly being threatened in this new land they lived. So as we read the chapter, on the surface, it seems that their life was in jeopardy by this burning furnace. But there were many other subtle, insidious, and systemic ways that these immigrants were being constantly threatened. The power brokers of empire sought to scare them with the use of might and edict, threatening them into silent acquiescence. For after all, that's just how it is. You just have to live with it. The threat of evil, you see, seeks to usurp the place of God in the life of God's people. And in order to do that, it depends on fear and intimidation to be effective. But the wielders of influence further tried to strip them of their very sense of self. The names that we hear them answer to in this chapter, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, had been changed from their birth names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And this is significant, not only because they were being divested of their very identity and heritage, but because they were being disrobed of their very religious belief. It's noteworthy that in their original names, they were all of them had references to God, such as God is gracious, Hananiah, or who is like God, Mishael, or God keeps him, Azariah. But now in their substituted names, they were substituted with references to the Babylonian god, such as Nebo, where Abednego means servant of Nego. If you can be stripped of who you are, then you will be left with nothing to cling to, and then you can be led into anything. But Nebuchadnezzar and his cronies ultimately tried to subjugate them through deliberate attempts to get them to change their religion. This is here seen in the order that they had in this part of the story to bow down and worship the golden statue of the emperor, and hence to submit to his authority instead of the God of Israel. Like they did in the enslavement of Africans in the New World, or with the Jews in the Holocaust. The power-hungry usually try to strip away the very identity and the very connections of the people on whom they inflict their evil in an effort to assert dominance or even to destroy them, to bend them or even break them. So in their situation of distress, how then could these three young men remain hopeful? What were their options? Of course, they could accept the religion of the king as superior to their own and just do what it takes to live in peace. Or they could go through the motions of bowing down to the statue while still retaining their own belief in private. Just play the game. Or they could organize a rebellion against oppressive religious practice. Just start a revolution. Yet they chose none of these. Instead, they decided to become living witnesses to what they believed. Their conviction and expression of hope rendered them willing to offer their very bodies as martyrs, as an act of faith in their God. Our God will deliver, but if not, we still will not bow. This is the very definition of hope for them. So what about us, sisters and brothers? Like them, do we feel embattled by the circumstances that scare us, that strip away at our very personhood, and that subjugate or overpower us, leaving us feeling defeated? When we encounter spaces of personal pain and suffering, whether the source is obviously evil or we're still trying to figure out where it came from, how do we remain hopeful and buoyant? What is it that informs our hope? Let me leave you with three things from this text. Firstly, hope arises from security. The assertion that the God we serve will deliver us comes from a place of conviction about the nature of the one whom they have come to know as the God that we serve. This security is anchored in their shared history. For God had called their people into existence. God had delivered them from slavery, given them new territories, and time again had saved their ancestors from being devoured by people in and around where they were living. They had memorials built to the honor of these memories. The stories of their past was always recited as part of a ritual that helped to embed their identity into their psyche. They knew whose they were and to whom they were eternally connected. And they knew that God was able to deliver. That sense of almost cockiness can be seen in the story of Elijah with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. There he sets up a showdown between his God, the one and true God, and Baal. And after the prophets of Baal had called on their God to consume their offering without any response, Elijah taunts them. Shout louder, he says. Perhaps he's deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. This kind of certainty doesn't come from a fleeting encounter, sisters and brothers. It comes from a studied appreciation. So when the young men told their king that we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter, they were asserting where their security or their assurance rested. They were establishing a contrast with Yahweh. It is God who would give the king an answer. The young men would not get into a contest with the king. It was God who would fight their battle. For they, like Elijah, were secure in their belief because of their deep and grounded understanding of their God that arose from an abiding relationship of trust. Secondly, hope is advanced by survival. Survival here is not to be seen in its limited sense as the survival of the men in their present situation. Rather, it is to be understood as part of a wider plan and action of God, ensuring the survival or salvation of God's people in a final and complete way. The king gets a glimpse of this when he looks into the fire and he points to the appearance of the fourth person like the Son of God. In the midst of the fire's damaging flames, there's a fourth person who looks like a man, but has the appearance of a God. Although the text doesn't tell us exactly who this figure is or what he does in the furnace, it seems that he is a divine figure who has come to protect and to deliver the three. So while some have suggested that might be an angel, many see the language of the Son of God, suggesting that the fourth figure is a prefiguring of the Christ himself. This is a preview then, sisters and brothers, of the clash between the power of God and the forces of this world, the forces of evil, which lead to deliverance from an unjust death at the hands of the empire, where the miraculous Son of God is not bound even by death, but gives hope for resurrection and total restoration for all people, because Christ was raised from the dead. It is the assurance of that complete salvation that gives impetus to our hope. It is the understanding that in the end, God will save God's people. No matter what the present circumstances look like, there is a guarantee that we have that God has the final word, and that God still has some options available of which we might not even be aware. That is what makes it possible for us to sing and dance in worship, even in the midst of difficult odds. That joy expressed in song and dance is a defiance of the circumstances that we face. How can you hope and praise God when you're facing such a horrible situation? It is the wagging of a defiant finger in the face of challenge, because our God will deliver. This joy born out of hope is a foreshadowing of the experience of complete salvation when God brings about the redemption of God's world once and for all. It is a reaching forward into the future, laying hold of God's promises even today. But thirdly, hope is asserted in submission. It is easy to read the "but if not" in verse 18 as an expression of doubt about God's intention or God's ability to deliver. So when the three young men say, God will deliver, but if not, are they giving God a kind of cop-out? The truth is, if not is a very real possibility, especially in the short term. They and us have no real surety that we will have our desired outcome in any particular situation. So what do we have? What we have is our confidence, our trust in God, that God is able and that God is kind. So when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, but if not, they were in fact surrendering their future to God, not to Nebuchadnezzar. In the process, they did not tie God's hands. Death does not limit or end God's capacity to create a future, to do something outside of the box, to act in novel and spectacularly new ways. By saying, but if not, they demonstrate an openness to God's working, whatever that working might be, or whatever form or way it might look like. When we read the "but if not," what it does is places us at the point where we relinquish the outcomes of our lives. Whatever are its contours and its contents, we relinquish them to God. It is then, sisters and brothers, that we learn that trust is not a formula. For if the three had known in advance that they would be spared from death in the furnace, they would be merely following a formula. The result would be in their control. God is not a vending machine into which we insert our faithfulness and voila, out comes the reward that we are seeking. But in the midst of persecution, the persecuted don't have a formula. Their devotion to God is based not on any kind of quid pro quo, or any this for that, any kind of fair exchange with God. Unlike Jacob, who attached all kinds of strings to his commitment to God, these three friends announce that their dedication is to God alone, and it is absolute, regardless of what happens to them. In their ultimate submission to God, they not only express, but they live out their hope. So as we leave this text today, let me ask you, what is it that you come to this space hoping for in this season of your life? And what is it that anchors your hope? Are you secure in the knowledge of your God as being able to meet every challenge? Are you confident that God will restore the whole creation with God's final and permanent salvation? Are you submitting to God in what you hope for, as well as submitting to God in the journey on which God is taking you? Let's hear the story today of God's faithfulness in the lives of the three young men as an encouragement, as an inspiration, today to inspire you to envision the mighty, sustaining presence of God that is with you in the midst of whatever fire that you are facing or that you will face. Let it inspire you to envision the day of God's permanent salvation that finally, ultimately, sooner will be done with the troubles of this world, and then reach forward to it with joy and dancing, even in the midst of your pain and mourning. Let this story inspire you to envision a life in which submission to God and to God's will is the way you express and live out your hope in God. For we know that our God will deliver. But if not, we still will not bow.